Right, well, welcome back. My name is Steve Lansing. I'm one of the complexity crew, I guess I could say, here at NTU. And it's a pleasure and really an honor to introduce Sander van der Leeuw, my friend and colleague, who is one of the handful of archaeologists who brought complexity into archaeology and archaeology into complexity at the Santa Fe Institute and elsewhere, with important results that partly you'll get a glimpse of probably in the talk today. So Sander is the author of 17 books and 100 and some articles and papers. He has taught at major universities in Europe. In 2012, he was named by the United Nations, let me get this right now, as champion of the earth for science and innovation. This succeeds his, in his earlier life, he was in 2001 named let me get this also right, the director of the National Council for the Coordination of Sciences and Humanities in France. So I remember the first talk I heard, and I won't bore you with the details, but the fact that I remember it is amazing, given the state of my memory these days. It was a talk about the Roman view of their settlements in southern France in the context of the modern view of that region of the world in southern France. And what Sander brought to that was both the archaeologist's precision. He knew exactly what had been done to that landscape, but he offered us a holistic vision of those two ways of seeing the same part of the earth. So I thought that was extraordinary. Now, let's see, I have to quickly say, he's got a long career, and I can just touch on a few highlights. But for me, a key moment came when he came to Arizona and reorganized an anthropology program that was kind of bumping along but not doing spectacularly well. It is now doing spectacularly well. It has been reorganized as a school of human evolution and social change. So that's really, he's given great credit by the profession for having rethought the relationship between the anthropology and the other social sciences. Since then, he's created numerous other schools and programs in Arizona, connecting also to the Santa Fe Institute. What else can I say? It's going to be a very interesting talk. So please welcome Sander van der Leeuw.
Okay. That helps. Never mind. I'll put that in my pocket. All right. Well, as you know, this is not a prepared talk. I only knew about my going to talk today about 2 days ago, and so most of this was done overnight, and you will see the traces of that. And in part, you will see the traces because I have relatively few images and way too many words to keep myself on track. So forgive me for that. The second thing I want to say is that, of course, after this morning's talk, anything said is a pretty hard act to follow. I was absolutely bowled over by the synthetic capacity of the speaker this morning and what actually he was talking about. Now, one reason for saying that is that from my own little perch in archaeology, I've been working on a number of similar concepts. And so you'll see me bumbling around, sometimes in his footsteps, sometimes a little bit beside them. We will figure that out later, and I'd love to talk to you about that once I've actually done this. The last thing is that I had originally been invited to give a talk on Thursday in a different workshop that is being organized, I think, by the art department officially, the School of Art and Design. So some of what I've done is actually cut my talk in two parts, because the first part I will jump over here. I will present it on Thursday, because I already presented a lot of those ideas here 3 years ago at your first Emergence Symposium, the More is Different Symposium. So I'm going to focus on a later period and on what I think is maybe one way in which we can go forward. Now, a last bit of my introduction, and you have already mentioned some of that, Stephen, is that I've been trained as an archaeologist and a medieval historian, but I have had a sort of a third university education when in the 90s, the European Union gave me a bag of money to work on sustainability issues in Southern Europe with anybody I liked. And they came from every discipline, and it was great fun. And so in some ways, what I'm talking about is also in homage to that very large team. We had 65 scientists and a whole bunch of postdocs and others who basically taught me interdisciplinarity. And so that is all I think I'm going to say as introduction. Let's get on with this. So I'm going to divide the talk in about 5 parts. First, some basics and concepts, and there in particular, I think there will be a relationship with this morning's talk. Then I will focus on urban societies in honor of Roland's talk yesterday, but that will be relatively short. And then I will basically be talking about European history over the last couple of millennia, but in, of course, a very abbreviated and schematic way. And then begin a chapter that has to do about the relationship between innovation and crisis. And then finally, I will end with a few remarks on what I think, and that's been part of my research over the last few years, what might be a social planetary boundary. I was part of the team that actually dealt with the physical ones, but the thing that we missed at the time, all of us, is if you argue that it's basically what we're up against is a societal problem rather than an environmental problem, then you have to go and find out if there are social planetary boundaries. And so I'll talk a little bit about that to end with. Okay. Many people, and one of the wonderful talks that I heard yesterday sort of already undercut a lot of that and made clear that it's much more complicated. But many people initially sort of thought about humans as particularly learning. I want to shift that a little bit, because I think what is even more crucial for our understanding of what goes on is that humans organize themselves. They organize their minds, they organize their physical environment, they organize their social environment. And in doing that, they experiment, they plan, and they design. And I think all those characteristics are really important if we want to get a sense of what's been going on over at least the last part of human evolution. So we need to adopt an organization perspective. And this is addressed particularly at a lot of biologists who have a population perspective and who look at individuals and a whole population, but do not in any detail look at the intervening organizational structures that are between the individual and the overall group that they are part of. Because once we do that, we realize, and that is where I am very close to what you said this morning, that societies are basically held together by the information they process. The energy is a constraint, and I'll get back to that in a moment. People harness energy by transforming the organization of their environment and thereby enabling themselves to get at that extra energy that they need. And so what I have looked at, and which I will mainly present on Thursday, is how we can follow that story by simply looking at human artifacts over long-term time. And when I say long-term time, it's about 1.5 million years. And we can follow how little by little people were able to conceptualize more and more complex actions. I won't get into that very heavily right now. I just want to accentuate that in that development, we have distinguished 2 major phases. One that is up to about 100,000 years before present, in which a lot of the acquisition of the capability of dealing with more dimensions is essentially biological. The short-term working memory, that is the part of our brain that brings together actions, dimensions, and things like that, develops, in our view, from about 2 or 3 dimensions to 7 dimensions over that long-term time. Now, what happens once that stage of 7 dimensions is reached is the fact that not only do we see this shift to collective learning, but also the combinatorics of those 7 dimensions allow us to suddenly deal with a huge number of new things. And so we see literally over the last 30,000 years an explosion of new ways of dealing with artifacts. That is the only way we can monitor this in archaeology, but nevertheless, I think that is an important part. So then the question is, if biology is no longer the constraint, what is both the constraint and the driver? And I would argue that, and I'll get to that in one of the next few slides, that that is a very interesting interaction between data, knowledge, problems, and people. And then finally, towards the end of my talk, I'll get on the consequences of acceleration, which clearly we have seen already this morning is totally out of this world. Now, in all of that, one of the things that is interesting for us as archaeologists is that we see this development sort of, if you look at it from these criteria, in many places. But of course, there are very different manifestations of that in every single place. And that points out that every single culture, every single society actually has been path-dependent in its evolution. And that is, in my mind, due to the interaction between solutions and problems. And I'll get to that in a moment. So let's sort of step back a little bit. Quite rightly, you've said this morning, and I think we're all aware, individuals live by processing matter. We need to eat. We learn how to learn, and we organize our world by processing information. The difference between the two flows is that matter and energy cannot be shared. They're subject to the conservation principle, but information can. And so what keeps human societies together are shared ideas, are our cultures, our forms of organization, basically the skeleton of our shared information processing apparatus. And of course, that also is what gives certain individuals more power than others, more wealth than others, and we'll get back to that as well. So this is what I mean with the sort of driver of that process once there is no longer a biological constraint. Problem solving structures knowledge. More structured knowledge increases information processing capacity. That allows the cognition of new problems, creates new knowledge, involves more and more people in processing the information, and then increases the group size that is involved and its degree of aggregation. That again creates more problems of a different nature now, social problems in particular, and that creates an increased need for problem solving and structures more knowledge. So that feedback loop, to my mind, is actually what drives this whole process from about 100,000 BP onward. And in a very primitive schema, I've tried to outline this. Basically, I think what is interesting is if you imagine this as a self-propelling mechanism, the people at the core, because they are at the core, process more information than the people at the periphery. And that is what I've tried to indicate with this figure A to D. Once that mechanism slows down, if the process in one way or other is hampered by physical constraints or other constraints, then the whole thing sinks as a pudding, as a souffle, and you end up with equality again, which is again a point that we've talked about this morning. So I would argue societies are bubbles, basically. The reflexivity loop that I've talked about, little by little in the society aligns individuals according to particular linguistic and institutional patterns. It creates the ecologies of compatible ideas that Brian Arthur has been talking about in recent days. And in doing so, they also shape their environment, their resources, their challenges, their solutions. There's a huge dimension of niche construction in there that I think is the counterpart. And one of the things that I've been arguing quite strongly is that when we think about these kinds of things, and you are clearly an exception this morning, a lot of my colleagues only think about the human part and don't think about the niche construction part. I think that's an important thing. So increased alignment means less diverse behavior and more interdependency. So the risk pattern changes once that actually happens. And I would argue that each individual action has unintended consequences. And the reason for that is that our minds, if they deal with, let's say, 7 or 8 dimensions, or even if they collectively deal with a larger number of dimensions, nevertheless, they don't capture the effect of their actions on all the dimensions that are relevant in the environment. And so that simplified version that we have when we act means that ultimately the actions cause all kinds of unintended consequences. And I think you can argue quite cogently that that results in the fact that when we think we know more, we actually know less, because we have changed the system more than we have actually acquired knowledge about it. And I think that is one part of what I'm going to get at later on in the talk. Now, another important element, and that goes to the sustainability people in particular, is that societies define their environment and leave out what they think is not relevant. They define what are the issues of the environment, what the challenges are, how to deal with that. And in all of that, they do so in ways that suit society and not necessarily the environment. And so sustainability is fundamentally, and this is important from part of the work that I'm doing, a societal issue and not an environmental issue as it has been defined in the whole context of climate change and so on and so forth. And I will get back to that later on again. So we have looked for environmental planetary boundaries, but we haven't looked for the social ones. Are there societal planetary boundaries? And I'm going to try and define at least one of them in a moment. This is something we've already talked about, but to harness the matter and the energy, we organize the world around us. The more we can organize, the more we can harness. Remember, one fundamental thing in the modern economic debate is that we have the concept of resources. Well, a resource is not a resource until it has been identified and integrated in the society as something useful. It's not just something out there. It is something that is part of that niche construction, and that is an important element of it. So, now we go back to the difference in dimensionality between the human cognitive system and our actions. I would argue that in that process of interaction with the environment, what we do is we systematically take out the frequent risks, the things that we observe many times. And we act upon them, and we make changes. But in doing that, we actually change the risk spectrum, because we take out short-term risks, and we insert unknown long-term risks. And ultimately, I think those catch up with us. And that is what brings us, as a society, to a tipping point. And so my question is, are crises actually evitable? And there is a huge amount of evidence that they are not, that virtually every society ultimately has run into a crisis. That is one of the reasons for calling societies bubbles. Okay, so I'm now leaving the whole first part of this whole concept, what leads up to the urban way of life. I'm jumping that. I will talk about that on Thursday, and it has been filmed 2 years ago and is available. I think one of the really important aspects about urbanization is that urbanization, in my mind, is due to the urge of that growing number of people to promote this collective thinking. And so I would argue that the information processing is the driver towards urbanization, and that energy is actually a constraint. That goes against some of the geographic ideas in particular. The need to solve problems drives the aggregation. And so what I think you end up with is a sort of dynamic flow structure, and I've borrowed that in part from Prigoghine's dissipative flow structures, because what a structure like that does, it dissipates chaos, it dissipates entropy by creating a structure in the society for itself. And so the outbound flow is organization, the inbound flow is energy. But all of that can only be kept going over the long-term time if you keep innovating. And so innovating is a crucial part of what this is all about, and I'll get back to that again. Okay, urban societies. Just a few bits of imagery. This upper left-hand slide is a reconstruction, clearly, but of one of the earliest and certainly one of the biggest urban sites in the Near East, Uruk. On the top right, another one from the western part of the same period, and then a couple of other ones. Now, the important part here, and this, Roland has mentioned this and others have mentioned this, but is two sets of facts. One, that urban systems always emerge in clusters. So you cannot think about cities individually. You have to think about urban systems. And that is important for a number of reasons that I may get to in a moment. The other thing that we observe in archaeology, and you have also, Roland, pointed that out, is the fact that we then see counting systems, but we also see legal systems. This column is Hammurabi's first Babylonian law column. We see administration, the clerk in Egypt. So for me, this is something where I differ a little bit from you, Roland, in particular. It is the balance between the energy network and the information network that actually drives how an urban system evolves. The energy networks are clearly dendritic. They gather energy and matter from the environment, and they actually distribute it in a dendritic way to all the people in the society. The information networks are actually very different. And we know this from all the many images that you have from Google and so on and so forth. They keep the community together, but they don't follow the same lines. They don't follow the same networks. And one of the topics that we need to start looking at is how those two things actually interact. I have not done that, but I think it's an important part. Now, what is interesting is that research done very recently at the Santa Fe Institute and our own department shows that if you do an allometric scaling exercise over different sizes of cities, you actually find that information processing and innovation scale superlinearly, energy scales sublinearly, and every activity that is directly related to the population, like bakeries and things like that, of course, scales linearly with the population. So that is, and I'll show you that in the next graph. Here you see on the top everything from new patents to inventors to private R&D employment and so on and so forth. All of those scale actually, as you can see, from 1.25 to 1.03, to 1.14 and 18. And then what we get is wages, bank deposits, GDP, and so on and so forth, which measure effectively things that are part of the population simply because they've been evened out. And then finally, all the way at the bottom, you get energy use, which is very clearly below linearly, and that argues, in my mind, for the fact that that is a constraint rather than a driver. So, we go back, hold on. No, I need to get one more other, no, it's okay. We'll just go on. So what I'm going to do now is take a slice of history and argue two important things. One of them is that history is not inevitable. It is path-dependent, but it's not inevitable. But this argument will also lead me to see if I can identify that societal planetary boundary that I think is an important one behind what is happening today. So, urban, okay. What happens in the Roman Empire? In the Roman Empire, you see the same dynamic of organization flow outward and energy flow inward, but the population numbers become so big that you actually cross cultural boundaries. And that imposes a number of different adaptations in administration, in military, and so on and so forth. The Roman Empire grew on the basis of the fact that for centuries, around the Mediterranean, information processing capacity had been accumulated and translated into wealth, so that when the Romans would actually hit one of these other tribes, they find treasure, they find all kinds of organization. And they were very clever at incorporating that in their own society. So that allowed them, between, let's say, the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD, to actually expand so widely. Now, what happened when they came to the point that they couldn't expand anymore? Well, the crucial passage is in Caesar's De Bello Gallico, where he says, okay, I have now spent 2 years all over France, conquering all kinds of tribes, getting all kinds of treasure. And now I'm here in Belgium and there's nothing I can conquer. Why the heck am I here? Because I have no enemies that are organized, I have no cities to conquer, I have no kings to abdicate, there's just nothing I can do. So what you actually see at that point is that when that expansion, that bubble, hits a point where it can no longer suck up new energy, it actually gets to be in trouble. And we see that trouble emerging over the 2 centuries that follow. The first reaction of the Romans to that was actually to then start a very intensive colonization of the territory that they've gathered. They built their whole system of villas and things like that, create and transform much of Gaul, Spain, North Africa into a huge agricultural area that gives them the kind of surplus that we were talking about this morning. In that process, because this is multicultural, we see a very interesting shift in how power actually works. Because in the beginning, what you see is that institutions have roles that channel the power to achieve certain things. But little by little, that transforms and it becomes institutions that have power over people. And that is a fundamental beginning, I think, of the kind of planetary boundary that we're talking about. So from conflict resolution to resource and people management. And the whole thing was held together not only by a very heavy administration and a very large army, but also by a major infrastructure effort that was carried out in those 2 centuries. And this shows the result of that. On the one hand, you see on the left how the Roman Empire expands, and the main point of the slide on the right is actually all the little roads that you see, all these major highways that are created throughout the empire that keep the information processing system intact and functional without too many time delays. Now, what happens at about 250? There's no stuff to be gathered anymore around the Mediterranean. And so the invention engine, and I'll get back to innovation in a moment, but the engine that creates new things by this interaction between problems and knowledge and thinking actually begins to stall because there are no new resources to be fed into it. That means that organization becomes too costly. And the emperors respond to that logically by devaluing their coinage, by adding more and more bronze to the silver coins. And that is what the graph on the right-hand side that comes from Joseph Tainter actually shows. So you get increases in taxation, you get increases in inflation. But at the same time, the gradient that keeps the Roman society together begins to level out. people in the periphery have learned Roman ways. And so they're much less interested in being part of the Roman Empire. They do their own thing. A fantastic example of that is the city of Trier in Germany, which becomes, towards the end of the Roman Empire, its own little empirelet. You can't call it anything else. So what you see at moments like that is that there is not a huge collapse. People basically go and become independent again and start working in their own ways about their own sort of things. As part of that, the emperors cannot manage the whole empire anymore, so they first split it into 4 parts, and then finally you see everywhere, but more so in the West than in the East, many sort of incursions from all kinds of tribes from around the empire. So then we get the Dark Ages. What is very interesting in the Dark Ages is that there is a huge entropy. There is very little alignedness. What we see is that lots of crafts and ways of doing things get lost. Engineering goes down very heavily in what it can actually do. Pottery making stops in every advanced way. Glass making stops, and so on and so forth. And so, essentially, much of the information processing network and what it had built up starts disappearing. There's very little trade. People are living rurally in their own little islands, and that's it. Now, what is interesting is that in that, only a few what used to be Roman cities survive. And the example I've given here is the arena in Arles, because we know from this period that the whole population of the city actually then went and lived in the arena, because that was the only defensible sort of thing that you could have at that point. Another fundamental aspect is that the whole rural settlement pattern disappears, gets restructured in around 1000 to 1200, and so we get there again a really new beginning. Okay, 1000 to 1200, and I've divided these up in sort of relatively artificial periods of 200 years so that I could do this quickly without getting into all the real historical details. What you see in that period is that little princedoms actually start fighting among each other. And little by little, they absorb themselves a little bit. It's like what happens in business these days, right? But it's little princelings, little people who claim that they're heads of something. And so ultimately what you get is that through this phase in which entropy is more or less in balance with information processing, with negentropy, ultimately you get larger and larger entities in that whole part of Western Europe. That leads to competition for access to local resources, and it ultimately leads to a feudal hierarchical structure. Why a feudal one? Because much of the economy at this point is demonetized, and land is about the only thing that you can reward anybody with. What do we see? We see from that period on, slowly but surely, the growth of new trade networks. Italy, Northwestern Europe, the Hanseatic League, a number of things like that. What we see a little bit later are the Renaissance city-states. And on the right-hand side here, I've tried to take an image that gives you the growth of France from about 1180 or 1100 to about 1328. Then you get the Renaissance. Now, what is really interesting there is that that is the first time since the Roman Empire, I should say, that we begin to see a substantive wealth differential. A local wealth differential between cities and the countryside, a substantive wealth differential within the city-states that we're dealing with. I would argue that that hits a limit that could not have kept going, but that what made it possible for the society to restructure is the Black Death. In the 14th century, there are 3 waves of the Black Death, and each of them kills off a very substantive number of the mainly urban population, which is the wealthy part of the population. And so people from the outside flood into the cities, take over the activities of the cities, and thereby give the system a new start. Then ultimately, we get to, let's say, 1400, 1500. And that is when other things begin to emerge. But I would argue, for the moment, just to summarize, that the wealth discrepancies that are emerging towards the 14th century basically would have led to a substantive problem for society as a whole, but that the plague actually reset the system so that it could again go into an expansionary phase. So what happens in the way of thinking? And I just want to highlight 3 elements that are really important. And yesterday, we saw one of those already. We saw the clock in Salisbury Cathedral. One thing that we see after the Black Death is time gets to be a different thing. It is no longer a cyclical thing, like in many agricultural societies, where life and death are simply part of the cycle of life, but it becomes something measured. What you see just below that is a danse macabre, which basically is a dance done by the living and the dead together. Death gets a very different significance. It actually now is very much seen as something special. What does that lead to? The medical school in Montpellier, for example, where people illicitly at night start digging up skeletons so they can study the anatomy of human beings. Another thing that we see is on the right-hand side here, portraits that really resemble someone. So far, most of portraiture is in more or less religious stereotyped forms, but individuation begins to come up. Another aspect of that is that it's when we find the first signatures of people lower than a king. Okay, now we have seen in that period, 1400, 1600, a continent-wide transition from rural barter to a more monetized urban economy, very localized and very patchy. That is something else that I thought was really interesting in your talk this morning, this patchiness of how these things work. But nevertheless, cities gain a major amount of power, trade and urban immigration. That leads to another limit around the 16th century. But how is that overcome? Things could have gone wrong there, but suddenly people start exploring the rest of the world. So they start incorporating in their system a huge number of new resources from other parts that actually give value, added value, to the system, because people are beginning to discover other ways to find value, and that is what drives an economy in the end. So what we see is new downstream processing areas and very strong information gradients between the center in Europe and the outside territories that were by that point basically trading partners. We see an increase in finance and banking. John Paget has worked about that in a fantastic way, for example. More monetization. The whole structure of the finance and banking system emerges as part of the co-evolution at that particular point. And then we get all these other resources that come from the outside in the form of gold and silver from the Americas, but in the form of spices and other things from the Far East. So what you see over the period 1600, 1800 is a restart, because new values have been found that could enhance what I will later call the value space of the society. And that in itself, I think, has been a major enabler, because information processing needs gradients. And in order to have gradients, you need people where there is less, and you need people where there is more. And by expanding this system across the world, suddenly that gradient became much steeper and allowed Europe to collect huge amounts of wealth. These are the kinds of wealth dreams that Roland was having yesterday. So we get this intercontinental resource acquisition. And then another really important aspect is this. There comes at any society, and we have studied this in great detail for the Maya, but I think it is also valid for other societies, a moment when an agricultural society does not have enough dimensions of value to further expand. And that is the moment that crafts come in, that long-distance trade comes in, because they actually feed that value space that is the core of what drives the system. These are these trading empires, just sort of to have a little break here. Then we get the next nexus, and that is one that you've talked about extensively this morning. You've talked about, Roland, yesterday, which is the whole Industrial Revolution. What we see just before the Industrial Revolution is huge social unrest. The American War of Independence, the French Revolution, similar movements in Germany and in other parts of Europe. And so what I would argue is that the system is again hitting this social boundary. That is, it cannot grow any further or keep going at its own rate without new innovations. And that is where the harnessing of fossil energy comes in. A lot of what we see since then is really only enabled by the mass availability of cheap fossil energy. And so in a sense, we're eating our way into the past as we're moving into the future. So the energy cost of innovation goes down, and the energy cost of innovation is particularly actually how people react to inventions. If we have a new invention, we change our behavior. And that change of behavior is something that takes a very substantive amount of energy. Now, what it also does, it starts accelerating the system to such a point that innovation becomes not only endemic, but actually becomes very strongly and more rapidly something that needs to be done in order to keep the whole system going. In the process, and in very gross terms, which I know in economics would be formulated differently, but what we get is a transition from innovation that is demand-driven. Invention has always been there, but innovation for a long part of the history of human species has actually been demand-driven. And from the moment that we have fossil energy, little by little it transitions to supply-driven. How do we see this? I'll give you one example from archaeology. We know, for example, that ironworking was possible 1,000 years before it was commonly used. What is the delay there? The delay is that the society wasn't ready for it. It didn't need it. It would have made a huge change because in Bronze Age Europe, power elites controlled their power because there were very few places where you could find the materials for bronze. Iron is something you find everywhere in Europe. As soon as people know how to work it, then it sort of runs over the whole of Europe, except for Scandinavia for other reasons. So what we argue is that for that whole period, basically the society always had to be ready and need the innovation before it was actually implemented. What do we see right now? Some clever lad has a bright idea, creates something bright, a big corporation eats it up, then uses a huge machinery of advertising to stuff it down our throats. That is what I argue, supply-driven innovation. But it also goes faster and faster. And one of my economist colleagues basically compares this to a Ponzi scheme. You have to run faster and faster and faster to actually keep ahead of the crowd. And I think that is a lot of what is going on in our current society. This is sort of a graph to show a little bit about this energy consumption. You already mentioned that we use right now in America 11,000 watts, whereas a body actually needs about 100 watts. And so we use more than 100 times the energy than we actually would need to physically survive. And this gives you a sense of how that explodes. Okay, then Once innovation becomes the main constraint of the system, because energy is plentiful available, we actually get into a situation where that innovation accelerates and resembles a Ponzi scheme. We go from demand to supply driven, and marketing fills the gap, and the end result is our global footprint that you see at the bottom on the right-hand side, which is exceeding the total Earth. Now, what do we get together with the Industrial Revolution? We get a major change in how the colonial empires are run. Because from trading empires, and in particular this goes for the Dutch and the British, these empires become production empires. The colonies become agricultural reservoirs. A huge amount of resource is actually pumped into the country in that way. And then, of course, the industrial production goes back out and creates markets and is thereby driving the sort of cyclical flow that drives the whole thing again. Now, one of the really important things for me thinking about this is that for way too long, we have very often, particularly in the natural sciences, seen history as inevitable. It's this whole idea of progress. We go up and down a little bit, but it actually keeps going. In archaeology, that is to a large extent due to the fact that we always have had an ex post perspective on the past. We've looked for the origins of what we have in the present. Historians have done much better at that. They generally have an interaction between ex post and ex ante that gives them a more subtle view of what's going on. One of the big innovations of the complex systems approach is that it actually forces us to have an ex ante perspective. And for archaeologists, that means that we position ourselves at a particular time and study what happened after and how it happened, which is very different from what we do when we actually look at the origins of what we have in the present. So we acknowledge the path-dependency, but we deny the inevitability. And I think that is an important lesson for us in the present day. Now let me talk a little bit about innovation. Part of how I got into this whole topic is realizing that we need to innovate our way out of our current dilemma. That's what all the politicians say and what a lot of people very fundamentally believe. But when you say that, you forget that 250 years of innovation in every which direction has actually got us into trouble in the first place. What you also forget, and that is something I'll elaborate in a little while, is that we seem to be reaching an innovation plateau. And I want to look at that a little bit more in detail. What we need to do, again, is to look at that value space. We need to find a different way to accord value to things, ideas, movements, and so on and so forth, so that we can actually try and shift the economic development in a different direction. And we need to do that in a sustainable way. Now let's first look at what the effect of an innovation is. I think it's important to realize, which is not, I think, sufficiently done in this kind of field, that what an invention does, it transforms everything, every time again. And so the technology, the ecology, the economy, and so on and so forth are simultaneously transformed, and that is one of the major energy eaters in the whole system. All of these are niches that interact among each other. And so in our research, they should also do that. There needs to be space in all these niches to implement an innovation. Otherwise, it won't take off. And more than that, the niches need to be alignable so that you actually get a degree of facility of handling all of that and not a huge dispersal of different directions in which it goes. That pushes for closer and closer cultural and social integration, which is now happening worldwide. That is what globalization is all about. But of course, large integrated systems bring their own risks, which can only be studied holistically. I heard that you had Dirk Helbling here a little while ago, who actually makes a very cogent argument about all of that. So what do we see? That is, but as I said much more at the beginning of the talk, the more we learn, the less we actually know. And crises are moments when a socio-environmental system is overwhelmed by the unintended consequences of its own anterior actions. And we'll get to that in a sec. I'll skip this one, not to make it too long. So, these limitations of perception lead us to unintended consequences. Ultimately, we have so many of those that what we can do is we get into a panic. We start thinking short term. We start looking at each and every one of those unintended consequences, and we lose the long-term strategic perspective that we actually had before. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but what is happening is, I think, that we are being overwhelmed by the consequences of our own actions. And so I would call crises not the way it's normally done. I would basically say they're a temporary incapacity of the system to process the information that is needed to keep it co-evolving with its context. Ideas are underdetermined by observations. They're overdetermined by past experience. That's another interesting hypothesis, in this case from Henri Atlan. He says, take 5 traffic lights. They have each 3 states. The system as a whole has 243 states. But the number of potential linking systems that could explain that are in the 100 billion. And so one of the limits that we always have, and this gets to the big data argument, I think, in some ways, is that we effectively will never be able to rationally make those decisions. And that means that basically in order to make them, we use past experience and we approximate them. And those are some of the reasons why we have this path dependency, because we always go back to our older interpretation of what is actually going on. Moreover, and that goes back to one of our early astronomers, we don't have that famous external leverage point that we could use to throw the Earth out of its orbit. We are ourselves. We don't have that kind of externality against which we can start working. So, I would argue that what has happened in those last sort of 1,000 years is basically we have integrated a world system around one core. Our production systems have increasingly aligned around efficiency, around more centralized control. Production and consumption systems have been disembedded from nature and society. A fragmented industry is controlled by finance. Consumed products increasingly transformed and artificialized and specialized. And longer production chains have been built up. The increasing focus on value and the ubiquitous movement up the value chain has further disembedded and fragmented our society and our global system as a whole. So, what have we done? We have drawn more and more resources from further and further into a very small, highly efficient information processing network that is that of the developed nations. To that effect, we have reduced transportation costs, transportation times. We've decoupled energy flows from information flows and all those kinds of things. So the result of that, to my mind, is the kinds of imbalances that we actually see. A wealth imbalance, a food imbalance, an education imbalance, a financial one, and more in general, a resource imbalance if you look all over and around the world. This gives you some idea about how this wealth discrepancy actually has been growing. You can see on the horizontal line poorer and richer countries, and then within those countries also the discrepancies at that point. These data are a little bit old, they're from 2011, but the system really hasn't changed in any which way. More than that, we've known this for a very long time, but it has become something that has drawn the attention of economists and others in recent days after the financial crisis. And I want to elaborate a little bit on that whole aspect. Piketty argues that we have a long-term increase in that wealth discrepancy. I could see that very easily, but I have not done all the work that would be needed, as actually that planetary societal boundary that the society in Europe has hit, then had to find new energy to go to the next phase, and so on and so forth. I think his data seem pretty solid, although I know that there's a lot of sort of pinching and shooting at it. They point to a growing concentration of information processing in the hands of the very few and a dynamic that is accelerating. Now, couple that with what Larry Summers has done more recently, when he says we're hitting a plateau. Our economic development can't keep going. And I would argue that from these graphs, you see some of the effects of that. At the top, top left, you actually see a graph that shows that the discrepancy between the money that is actually invested in the real economy and the money that is invested in the speculative economy is actually increasing over time and has particularly increased since the mid-1800s. You see at the lower left-hand side how bank debt is more and more used for speculation. Very important in this is on the right top hand that we actually see by an analysis of patents and their effect that the productivity of innovation has declined 22% in a generation. And more, that the return on R&D investment in the lower right-hand side has also been quite dramatic. So what is happening here? Are we hitting an innovation boundary? Maybe. Would that be what actually is the other part of the societal planetary boundary that is in the wealth discrepancy? So what I'm effectively arguing is that now that our core has extracted from the periphery all that it can, and the productive economy is on the way to being dwarfed by the speculative economy, we have to rebalance those. And from an extractive economy, we have to move to a nourishing one. And I'm going to illustrate that very briefly by a change in thinking in the international climate negotiations. What we've seen so far on the United Nations efforts is a question of burden sharing. We have a calamity that's coming up that needs to be averted, that is going to cost a lot of money. So how can we fight out who pays the most of that money to do something about this? Now, you could very easily rephrase the context of that debate, and that is what is ongoing at the current time, towards not burden sharing, but opportunity creation. What we see in the negotiations now is that countries are committing themselves in their own way to their own amounts of CO2 reduction. That is a very fundamentally different way of doing it. Personally, I have never been able to understand how the United Nations thought that it could get 180 countries on the line. Yes, of course, it's all the same greenhouse gases, but these economies and these cultures are so hugely different that you could not possibly have expected that to work. So what do we do now? We do a bottom-up movement, and we do a movement that actually hopes to create, and there's work being done in China, in Germany, and in Europe about that, such a dramatic reduction of CO2 that it really innovates and restructures a lot of what our industries are all about. So I would argue that the core of all of this is that we have a unique opportunity if we find ways to expand that value space, the global value space, in ways that are different from what we are doing now. I would argue, and we've talked about this yesterday, we've talked about this to some extent today, that the ICT revolution is giving us an amazing occasion to do that. We have never had an occasion that is so dramatic. It took humans about 1 million years to master dealing with matter in 3 dimensions. That's a part that I'll be talking about on Thursday. It took us a number of hundreds of years to master energy with the discovery of fossil energy. The information revolution is so young that it will change everything beyond any possible imagination. Some interesting aspects of that beginning change are the fact that this is going to fundamentally change our economy. In a recent Economist issue on the economic changes that we're going to be seeing, they argue very nicely how low-wage menial jobs will keep their numbers, how highway information-rich jobs will probably expand, but how most of it in between is going to be replaced by technology. Lawyers are going to be replaced by technology, according to a number of people. Medics, to some extent, the same way. So we're actually working towards such fundamental societal changes that we need to grab that whole thing in hand and start working to control it. I would argue that we need to invert the current flows. And basically, more and more, I'm convinced that one of the issues is that a lot of economics is about value allocation and not about structuration, about value creation. And that what we need to do is come up with different things that we value. And one way to do that is basically stimulate people in the periphery to use their value systems to actually create localized economic islands that work well. We see some of this happening in Africa, for example. We need to exchange our short-term strategies for long-term strategies again. And ultimately, we need to expand that global value space to offer new opportunities for the economy. Now, why am I arguing this? Because you could argue the opposite as well. Because one of the fundamental debates in sustainability is still the debate between sustainability on the one hand and development of the underdeveloped part of the world on the other hand. And that is a dilemma that we need to ultimately do something about. But we can only do that while reducing resource use. And so I would argue that the economy depends on value differentials. And that so far, the differentials are all into the favorable side of the developed countries, but that we need to start inverting the flow. The differentials will stay, and that means that we actually get a similar situation and an active economy, but one that actually distributes resources rather than concentrate them in a particular part of the world. And so some of the things that we can do there is do the reverse of what a lot of development economics does, where Western ideas are brought to other cultures. We need to develop immaterial aspects of our economy. We need to differentiate local values. We need to develop holistic values, dehomogenize, re-embed, localize, to shorten production chains so that we don't have these long transport chains that are so costly, disaggregate industries. Anyway, there are many, many others, and I don't want to sort of stretch this beyond the reasonable. But I would argue that the transition is totally beyond our imagination, and that anything that goes and thinks about those things at current time is absolutely essential, and that sort of goes back to all of you in the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sander, for an amazingly provocative and stimulating talk. Before I invite questions, I wanted to remind the audience that if you'd like to hear the beginning of this talk, you can come to the Art, Design, and Media building, the beautiful glass building sort of behind us here, on Thursday at 5 p.m.
Is it? I thought it was 4:30 I had to be there. Is Meridel there? He wants 5 o'clock. Then it's 5 o'clock. He's the boss.
Right. So, Sander, will you take some questions?
Of course.
All right. Please.
Yes, please.
Look, thanks very much for, as people have said, an amazingly provocative talk. The changes that you talk about are very challenging. And one of the things that you mentioned, which I think will be a problem, at least in the short term, is what you talked about, the, I'm just looking at my notes here, that's right, where our ideas of the problems that we face are underdetermined by observation and overdetermined by experience.
Clearly.
It seems to me within the political process, and I've been thinking about the political process in my own country, Australia, recently, this is an extremely difficult problem, especially where the ideology of some of the key players comes in, and they focus on experience rather than observation. They seem willfully blind, to coin a phrase. I'm just wondering what possible ways of overcoming this problem you've thought about?
I think a lot of it is a question of experimentation. I think we need to shift from a top-down expectation that this will change to a bottom-up expectation that this will change. I see in current society lots of people who want to do that. And one of the interesting things that is emerging is that cities are beginning to actually take the lead in all of this. Now, cities have a huge advantage, and that is that they're relatively homogeneous. They actually have a particular environment, a particular climate impact, so they can do more tailor-made solutions to some of these issues. I don't know if you're familiar with the transition towns movement that we have in Britain right now, which cities like Brighton and others have basically taken it all in their own hands and have basically mobilized large parts of the population in moving towards different ways of thinking about their own economy, about recycling, about sustainability, and so on and so forth. So I think what we will see is a restructuration from the bottom up in which lots of different places experiment in different ways with this. Some work that might be relevant in that context is, for example, a study that has led to the Energiewende in Germany, the abolishment of nuclear energy. Initially, the predictions were that with a 20% reduction in CO2, things would go fine. But recalculation argues that a 30% reduction actually creates very different economic conditions that will lead to a lot of innovation. So I think what we will see is different elements in different places that will try and adapt to this ultimately. I'm not saying that it'll all work. I'm not saying that I am particularly optimistic. I'm not overly pessimistic either. And that comes from the fact that if I look at it on the short term, I can be pessimist, but in the long term, humans have always found a way to sort of survive and get to where we are now. So as an archaeologist in the long term, I'm actually quite optimistic. Okay. Yeah.
Here, even on this slide, you say that we should, society should include more values.
Yeah, it is working.
So you talk about subsequent inclusion of more and more values, non-versatile, immaterial kinds of. You have so many types of values there to include. And then you also say that there will be possibly increase in information jobs, jobs related to kinds of processment of information. But then also you say that, I'm just concerned, law will be automatized and lawyers kind of disappear.
I know that would attack you.
The question is that law is just social system, basically, social regulatory system that is entirely based on meanings. And there are plenty of publications about nowadays, like technologies and law, where actually high-level specialists doing research for European Union say that even behind attractors in legal environment stay exactly values. So these kind of things stay behind that. So what do you mean by automatizing law and getting rid of these people?
This is not my own argument. This is the argument that actually is developed in the Economist paper that appeared, I think, in November at quite length. And basically what they're saying is it's the middle level jobs. It's not the jobs of the lawyers that are leading the thinking that are going. It's the jobs of lots of legal secretaries, people who write contracts and things like that. And so there is a tendency, what I gathered from this particular paper, where we actually see that the middle level of relatively routine human jobs, that is getting squeezed, that those jobs that cannot be done by anything else will remain, and that at the top end, the high information processing jobs, the original jobs, and the jobs that create value and so on are going to also remain. Now, again, you can flaw this analysis, and I'm happy to flaw that with you. I was just trying to point out that the scope of the changes that we're going to undergo over the next 50 years is totally beyond our imagination. And that if we do not, at this point, grab that problem and actually start actively working in steering that development, we are going to be in quite substantive trouble. However, if we actually do go ahead and grab the cow by the horns and try and steer that development, we may find a way in which we can create a different economy that is more based on immaterial values and on very different values that we haven't even conceived of right now. Okay. Yeah.
Sander, there's
Yeah.
is this on?
Yeah.
There's a very interesting implication of this discussion we've been having about information systems triggering growth and energy triggering growth. I had concluded many years ago that the two operated separately, and it's very interesting to see this new information which shows that that is the case in the system now. It leads to a very worrying implication about outcomes, which is part of the whole debate about low-density urbanism.
Yeah.
If it is the case that the information systems and their networks form up in some disjunction with the energy systems, one of the things we've been seeing in the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution where we are is a disjunction between those two.
Yeah.
And that's part of the dynamic of what is going on.
Yeah.
The other component that it leads to is that it is clear that urbanism is moving generally to low-density patterns. And the point I've been making about low-density patterns is that they're relatively low stress. Compared to high-density settlements, the communication cost and interaction cost is very low. The trend to low density is paradoxically a trend to using relatively small amounts of energy. It's a proportionately low energy demand trajectory. In other words, it's behaving as if there isn't quite enough energy floating around in the world, rather than what we tend to think of is that there's a huge surplus. So what is worrying is that we're moving towards a system which we think of as very demanding and very stressful in low-density cities, but actually isn't. And it's only stress that will drive innovation. If we were going to high densities, innovation would be driven very powerfully. We may not have a driver of innovation in the expansion of our low-density cities. That would suggest that your point about pegging on climate change and pegging on what to do in relation to the 50% of humankind who are not in cities may be the critical path for getting innovation to move. Innovation may be running at a very low level and may not need to be very elaborate to allow low-density cities to work. That's a quite serious implication.
It is, and I'm glad you bring it out. You bring it out so clearly. The one thing that I also feel we need to take into account is the discrepancy there between what is happening in Africa, for example, and what is happening in our part of the world. If we get, let's say, a 2 or 3 speed situation in that process, I think we will be in trouble in different ways yet again. Okay, but yes, sure.
That's revealed very serious.
Yeah. Yes, please. Behind you, just behind you.
Sure. Hi, thanks for that very interesting talk. I'm Mahesh Uttamchandani from DSO National Laboratories in Singapore.
Okay.
I was intrigued by your concept on bubbles and being able to predict crisis. Do you think that all crises can be predicted? If so, what can we do about it? And what do you think are the biggest upcoming crises? For me as a biologist, I'm worried about the next outbreak that may wipe out the human race. But you talked about the plague, Black Death, smallpox, other kinds of outbreaks. What are your thoughts on some of that?
I'm happy to do that. On the one hand, to give you a very simple example of a crisis in a very different context. New Guinea, a tribe called the Huli. They normally have their houses on the crest of the mountain. And the women have to go down into the valley to get the water every day. At a certain point, because people there have a different temporal conception, when something goes wrong there that they observe, they try and go back in time and find out what has been going wrong. They do that by ceremonies. Ceremonies demand pigs, because that's what they slaughtered. So ultimately, the bigger the crisis, the more pigs, and in this particular case, the tribe ends up in the valley where it never wanted to live, in the marsh that it created itself. I've done a similar story for the Western Netherlands and the way it actually evolved its whole below sea level landscape, for example. Now, so I do feel that in the interaction between humans and their environment, ultimately there always are a number of these crisis moments. And what I've tried to argue is that that is the result of the unintended consequences of earlier actions, simply because those are consequences that we wouldn't even be able to see, right? Now you argue about the present. And as one of the people who's been working with the team on the planetary boundaries thing, I think the biggest danger for us at this point is not a particular crisis. It is that all these are parts of the same crisis, and that it is the conjunction between biodiversity loss, increase in nitrogen and phosphate, ocean acidification and things like that, that if two or more of those boundaries are actually exceeded, we get, because it is a complex system, a situation that becomes totally uncontrollable. And that is where I think we need to find a way to begin to tackle that from a societal point of view rather than from an environmental point of view. Okay? Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up the point about uncontrollable and uncontrollability.
Yeah.
And to what extent are we looking at complexity from a sort of deterministic, we would like to control point of view, and therefore seeing it as a problem and then making a construct, which means we've got to grab the bull by the horns and control,
you're
versus seeing what's happening in the world from a complexity point of view, which says, well, it is uncontrollable because it's self-organizing and no one part of the system can control. And if that point of view is taken, to what extent can we then enable more complexity, i.e. interconnectivity between the various agents? And I'm just wondering where the balance is, because I'm not sure, it's not a black and white here, but where's that balance?
It clearly isn't, and clearly in my language I have used elements of both these things. I think that one of the, I don't know whether I call it an obsession, but it's clearly something that in archaeology is really, really clear. We basically construct stable phases and very quick transitions in the way we study archaeological materials. That basically means that we assume stability and we try and explain change. Once you turn that the other way around and actually accept with Heraclitus that change is what is permanent and that what is inhibiting change is what humans do, you put a whole different light on the study of innovation. But that is something that so far has not been explored very much. And so I would like to see that explored. I do see in what I mentioned as a response to the gentleman there on what is happening in the urban movements, not only in Britain, but in many places, the kind of experimentation that you're talking about. And I do believe that ultimately that is a very fundamental part of what we're doing. Now, whether that and how that might then dismantle an existing situation, of course, that is totally uncontrollable. Okay?
So enjoy the ride.
Yeah, you might as well, as long as it lasts. Over there. Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
I'm really intrigued by your new values-based components. I'm curious as to how to engage the human population on a discussion of those values. In many parts of the world, it is just very difficult to have a conversation fundamentally about values, either because of repressive governments or just social taboos. And I guess my question is, even in freer democracies, it is also difficult to have a conversation of fundamental values because you have so much diversity that there is very little consensus on what values are fundamental. And I guess, how do you engage the human population in its entirety? Because I think in some ways, to get to a human consciousness level, you almost have to do that.
Well, I am not sure about that. I think a lot of this will not be because of discussions. I think the main thing I was arguing is that as developed nations, we have set examples of values that are imitated in many different places. And that, I think, is one of the huge impoverishments of our global value space. And so I would argue for having people in different places do this on their own and do it rather than have discussions about it. But that means that our policies as Western nations have to fundamentally change. And because what we've been doing, we've basically been flattening out all of those differences. And I think that has been a big mistake. We argue it, and we even at the level of the UN sort of make a big convention about biodiversity. But I would argue that the cultural diversity is as important as the biodiversity, and that therefore, or more, or whatever, but that definitely we should not be flattening that out either. And that, I think, is a big lesson from all of this sort of stuff. There was somebody, yeah, somebody out there.
Just to add on to this question, actually, I mean, there are certain value systems that we Westernized people would find rather abhorrent.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is, yeah, it's good to, we want to have a diversity of values, but on the other hand, there's a certain place where we want to say, okay, these are the good ones, these are the bad, and how do we sort of balance that out, I guess?
Well, I suppose that as an anthropologist, I have a bit more sort of latitude in what I accept and I don't accept, because I can see how in different cultures these things function differently. Now, our big dilemma, of course, is that we have now engaged in a globalization that makes everybody dependent on everybody else. And that in itself is a leveling effect, because as I said for earlier societies, it aligns values between people over time that initially were not aligned. And so the dynamic that we're in is actually quite, from that perspective, I think, a very risky dynamic. And we need to start thinking about how we balance that dynamic with the preservation, and not in the sense of sort of nature preserves, but in a different way of the cultural differences that we're actually talking about. And I think one of the few ways in which we can do that is to actually stimulate people with different cultures to actually move ahead and do their thing.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, yeah. He was earlier already.
So talking about imbalances in our society, in case of different resources, so imbalances has a twofold effect in our society. The first one is that that we need a bit of imbalance in our society to continue the dynamics.
Hold on for a moment. I was a bit distracted. Can you repeat this from the beginning, because there's something I missed out there.
Okay, so what I'm talking about is the imbalances in different sectors, in different type of resources.
Yeah.
For example, wealth as well as other resources as well. So what I'm saying is that these imbalances has twofold effects in our society. We need a bit of imbalance in the society to keep on the dynamics of the society, as well as more imbalance somehow results in form of frustration and some kind of revolution in the system. So there are revolutions in different sectors. So what happens is that most of the imbalances doesn't merge together. In some time or in some space, we get industrial revolution. At some other time and space, we get educational revolution, and we pass through those. But I wondered what will happen if all those revolutions merge together in in the same instant. Can we be able to sustain such a revolution, or what will be the after effect of?
All I can say is that I think we'd have a lot of trouble doing that. Okay? I think that this is the same thing as I said for the planetary boundaries paper, that once a number of these different things start interacting with each other, we actually have no sense anymore where things are going, and then, okay, let's get along for the ride, but we don't know where we end up. Okay?
Well, so this morning we've covered the first 4.5 billion years and had a peek at the future. It remains to offer this memento and token from